Hi, I'm Pam Fox. Welcome back to my Bible study in the book of Genesis. So today we're in Genesis 6. Last week in Genesis 5, we went over the generations basically of Noah, from Adam unto Noah. And this Genesis 5 rolls right into Genesis 6, a continuation of telling this story, this foundation of this man Noah, and this very important story in the Bible. And so here in chapter 6, we're going to go in a little bit deeper about what was happening in the earth at the time of this man Noah. We're going to talk a little bit about Noah, and we're going to hear the introduction of God giving Noah instruction to build the ark. And then next week we'll roll right into chapter 7, talking more about the flood. But today here in chapter 6, it's more foundational information to the story of the flood itself. So I'm in the King James Version, Genesis chapter 6. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So here in these first few verses, we have something very interesting that takes place. And it's a bit of a mystery. There's, different people have different interpretations of what is going on here. So let's break it down a little bit. So it says, and it came to pass. So we're talking about the early days, the beginning of God's creation, and it says some time went by, and it came to pass. When men began to multiply in the face of the earth, that's what God told man to do, to go forth and multiply and fill the earth. So we have this multiplication taking place, which would make sense. When you start out with two people and they start to procreate, we start to have this exponentiality that starts to take place, right? Where the growth starts to really take place. So it says that men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. This word fair means they were beautiful. But let's go back in verse 2. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men. So first of all, who are these sons of God? When we look up this actual phrase, sons of God, let's do that right here in the Strong's really quick. I'm just going to go into my search function and type in sons of God, and we want the actual phrase. So we want to go into and look for the exact phrase. We're going to see that this phrase comes up several times in the Bible. It comes up twice here in Genesis 6, this reference of the sons of God. And then in the New Testament, it comes up. Paul talks about it in Romans. John mentions the sons of God in both the book of John and then in 1 John. We have mentions of the sons of God. Now, in the New Testament, that phrase, sons of God, in its context, it's always referring to humans and our potential. It says, for example, John 1 verse 12, it says, but as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. In 1 John 3, bestowed upon us that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. And then in 3:2 it says, beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear that we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, referencing Jesus, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Now that's the New Testament in the Greek. But when we go back to the Old Testament, this phrase, sons of God, it's used here in Genesis. It's used again in the book of Job 3 times. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. Again it says, and again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. So Here in Job verse 1 or chapter 1 and verse 2, we have this mention of the sons of God coming to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also. So it's this idea of really in the Old Testament referencing sons of God. It would be referencing different beings other than humans. We could say angels. These angels came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan also came to present himself before the Lord. And in Job 38:7, it says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. The morning stars are symbolic for angels. So it says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So we see in the Old Testament something different from the New Testament. We see this picture of, you could say, angels. And what we have to remember about angels is there's good angels and bad angels, right? We saw that in Revelation where we have this battle among the God's angels and then these demonic angels. And we see also in Revelation where it says the lake of fire was specifically created for Satan and his angels. For Satan and his angels. And we know a little bit about Satan or Lucifer. We know that the Bible tells us that he was an angel and that he was a fallen angel because he was really something quite spectacular. He was really something quite amazing, and he knew it. And so, like, if you've ever had a job where you thought to yourself, well, if I was the boss, I would do it this way. Or if this was my company, things would be a lot better because I would run it this way. I think that's what Lucifer, that's what Satan thought. He thought, well, if I was God, I could do a better job. And so God allowed him to go on his way. Well, he was thrown out of heaven eventually, but there was a time where Satan had this access into the presence of God and into heaven. It says here in the book of Job that that these sons of God came to present themselves, and Satan came also to present himself before the Lord. So all that to be said is we have angels, both good and bad. And here in Genesis, we have the first mention of these sons of God, and it says that they took wives. It says they took them wives of all which they chose. So the question then becomes, like, one, why would they do that? And two, like, why would God allow them to do that? And the thing we have to remember is when we go back to Genesis chapter 1, we see the introduction of Satan, and it says he was the most subtle of all the other creatures. And that word subtle means crafty, so he was the most crafty. We also know that when God, when he cursed the serpent, that is the devil, he told him that there would be enmity or hatred between his seed and the woman, that is Eve, between his seed and her seed. And of course we know that from the line of Eve came Jesus being born of the Virgin Mary. And the serpent was told that through the line of Eve would come one that would crush his head. And so because he's crafty, of course he's going to try to come up with a way to corrupt God's plan. Right? So this makes sense that what he's doing here is Satan is sending his angels to the earth to impregnate as many women as he can to corrupt God's creation, to corrupt the bloodline, to corrupt the DNA, to intermarry, to create a transhuman race, really. And so that when the Messiah or when Jesus would come and be born into this world to crush the head of Satan, eventually, so that he wouldn't either he wouldn't be able to do that, or he would be born into a transhuman or a corrupted creation, which would be different than the original creation that God made. So this is how I look at this. There's just a couple of lines here that talk about this. Let's read it one more time. That the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Verse 3. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he is also flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So there's a couple of things here. The Lord is speaking, and he says, my spirit shall not always strive with man. Now this word strive, you and I think of it as to work really hard, but when we look it up here in the Hebrew, The word strive, to strive as a law, to execute judgment, and to plead the cause. So to plead the cause would be like a defense attorney. That's what they do. They plead the cause, right? And so we have a picture of a judge and a defense attorney, which are two different things. But God is saying, my spirit shall not always strive with man. So my spirit will not always contend to plead or defend mankind, or will not always be in a position of constantly having to execute justice. He says, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. So some people think this means this was the beginning of the shortening of the human lifespan, because we saw all up until this point that the lifespan was around 900 years. Now we're going to see the lifespan shrink to no more than 120 years, or thereabouts. And so some people think that's what they're talking about, but we have to look at the context here. We're talking about here in the context the foundations of this man Noah, right? The foundation of the story of the man Noah. And here it's saying, it's the author is reminding him that God's creation is flesh or humanity, yet his days shall be 120 years. So a lot of people think that it's simply saying that from the time God proclaimed this, and the Lord said in verse 3, there was 120 years that went by before the actual flood occurred. Okay? So there was 120 years where Noah had time to build the ark, fill it with food, let the animals come to him, which we'll see later. And it gave the world really a chance to repent, right? Which we know that they didn't, but there was that chance. Verse 4. And then it goes on in the same thread of what we're talking about here. It says, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, put a pin in that because we'll come back to that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children with them. The same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. So here this word giants in verse 4. It says there were giants in the earth. So basically what it's saying is these sons of God, or these angels, or Satan's angels, came. They married the women. They had as much offspring as they could. They had as many children as they could with these women to possibly corrupt God's creation, or the DNA or the bloodline, to create a transhuman species. And it says that their children, their offspring, were giants. Now, this word giant, when we look this up in the Strongs, we see the word Nephil or Nephilim. And these giants, they were very tall, they were big, they were giants, but they were also bullies and they were tyrants. Okay, so these were the offspring of this process of these angels marrying human women and having children. So it says one more time, there were giants in the earth in those days and also after that. So God destroys everything with the flood except for Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives. And yet there were still giants after the flood. And we see this very clearly with the introduction of the Philistines. The Philistines were recorded as being extremely tall and large people. They were tyrants and they were bullies. And their army, when the story of the Philistines was introduced there with David and Goliath was a Philistine. No one could come up against these Philistines. Their armies were impenetrable and unbeatable because they were giant and they were tyrants and they were bullies. But getting back to verse 4, we have these giants in the earth in those days and also after that. So the question then becomes, well, if God kills everything to try to rid the earth of this transhuman race, why were these giants there then after the flood as well? And there's a couple of theories on that. One is that the angels, for a period of time, continued to be allowed to intermix with humans. That would be one explanation. Another would be that one of Noah's son's wives could have been a transhuman as well, which would have continued that bloodline until later when these giants were. I mean, the story of David and Goliath, David kills Goliath, and there's wars and all of that. And of course, we don't see giants like that today. So we have tall people, but not like, 10 feet, 11 feet tall, or however tall they were. They were really tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet. I can't remember, but they were really tall. Okay, so let's get back to this. So we have in verse 5, it says, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." That's a huge sentence right there. I'm going to read it again. God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Here we have the author saying that the world was, that the wickedness was great in the earth, which meant the wickedness probably was predominant in the earth. Um, it wasn't the entire earth, and we're going to see that in a moment with Noah, with the introduction of Noah. But the wickedness was great on the earth, and he says, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So within the community of wickedness that was so great in the earth, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart, that means every intention, every thought, every manifestation or action that came out of these people began with an evil imagination of the thoughts and of the heart. So, and God was able to look down on these people and see exactly what was going on, that the people had become extremely evil and extremely corrupt. Verse 6. It says, "And it repented the Lord that he made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart." So a couple of things here. This word repent, when we look at it in the Strongs, it is the word nacham, and it means to be sorry. It means to be sorry. So God was sorry. He was sorry that he had created, that he was sorry for his creation. It says he was sorry for his creation. He repented that he had made man on the earth. And it says, and it grieved him at his heart. So really what the author is letting us know here is that God has emotions, that God is looking down on the earth at his children, at all that he has created. He's seeing what they're doing, he's seeing what they've become, and he's grieving. And he's sorry that he ever created humankind, which isn't to say, I mean, he's still God. I mean, he knew it was going to happen, right? He knows everything. So this isn't saying that it was a surprise. It's like, oh, surprise, I failed. It's not that. It's letting us know that God has emotions and that he grieved when he looked down and saw the lack of love and compassion among his creation, and what Satan had done to corrupt creation. And so he's grieving. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, like, when my own children like do things that disappoint me, I never ever have ever thought to myself, oh, I'm sorry I ever created them. But if I had a child that was a serial killer, right, and they just do horrible, evil things that lack all sorts of love and compassion, I might regret that I ever brought that person into the world because of all the harm and the suffering he's caused in the lives of people. And so I feel like that's what God is seeing here. Humanity is so corrupt, and we're going to see that in a moment. It's going to go on to describe how corrupt they are, but they're so corrupt, and they're lacking compassion and love, and just like they're committing all kinds of sinful, evil things that are against who God is and what he intended for his children. And so he's grieving. It says that it grieved him at his heart. Verse 7, "And the Lord said, I will destroy man who I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." So here we have the introduction of Noah, but before that he goes on, he's saying, I will destroy man. He's going to destroy man, the beast, the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air. Notice he doesn't destroy the sea life. He's going to destroy them in a flood, so many of them will survive that flood because they live in the water. I'm sure many of them died, but he's going to destroy the man, the beast, the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air in one big flood, one big, I can't take it anymore. You guys are awful. I'm ending this. It's a purge, so to speak. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now remember, that word grace means undeserved favor. Noah didn't do anything special to deserve God's favor in terms of being really, really amazing. He walked with God, and we're going to see that in a moment when we talk a little bit more about Noah. He had a relationship with God. He feared God, and that's where the grace of God was placed upon, in the eyes of God, on Noah. Okay, verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. So remember, the author just came off of describing the family tree from Adam to Noah. So if you want to go back, you just go back the last chapter or a couple paragraphs back, and we'll see these generations of Noah. The line that was protected by God from Adam unto Noah, right? It wasn't infiltrated. It wasn't corrupted by these sons of God that were having children with earthly women. So it says, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. So we see a couple things here about Noah. One, God protected his family. God protected that line. From Adam and to Noah, he didn't allow the DNA to be corrupted by this intermarrying with these sons of God. He protected that line. It was free game, I guess, but he protected that line because remember, there was the coming of the Messiah, the one who would crush the head, the coming to the earth, born as a human being, to then die to redeem humankind, and then to be changed, or to be glorified and to be made into something new, just like we are promised to be made into something new. We humans are promised to be made into something new, just like Jesus was. Those of us that put our faith in Jesus. So we see that he was, he had his generations were perfect. He was a just man. So to be just, that word just, it's short for justice, righteousness, that which is right. Noah, because he walked with God, he feared God, he had a relationship with God. He knew what the difference between right and wrong. He knew what pleased God. He knew what was right in the sight of God. He was a just man, which means he stood up for what he thought was right. He stood up for what he thought was just. He would defend anyone that he felt was treated unfairly. He was a just man. So he had perfect generations, that is, incorruptible bloodline going back to Adam. He was just, and it says he walked with God, which means he loved God, he feared God, and he knew God. He had a relationship with God. Verse 10. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So before we saw that every imagination of the thoughts of the heart was evil continually, but if your heart and the thoughts of your heart are evil continually, that's going to manifest in your life, in your actions, and when you do and what you say, right? What a man thinketh, he becomes. So we see here that the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence, right? That's the manifestation, violence. That's the manifestation of the continual imaginations of the heart. And the imaginations of the heart, it says every imagination, it says that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was evil continually. So we can only imagine the type of corruption and violence that took place in the world because every imagination, right? If you could imagine it, they would do it, right? And when it comes to sin, like, I don't know, it can never fulfill you or satisfy you. You always have to move on to the next, bigger and badder thing when it comes to sin. If you don't experience forgiveness and repentance and healing over that sin, right? You just have this continuation. Like it says, that it was continually evil all the time. That word continually means it keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. So God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. And for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Here in these 2 verses, 11 and 12, the author says the word corrupt 3 times. The earth was corrupt. Behold, it was corrupt. All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. So this little line here, all flesh had corrupted his way. we can look at two different things here. We can see that Satan has a plan, and he's trying to corrupt God's creation by creating this transhuman race, by breeding angels with humans. And we can blame it on the angels, right? Which that's true. But here the author is saying flesh had corrupted his way, which lets us know that even these transhumans had a choice, right? But they continued to corrupt their own way. They could have turned their back on sin. When they saw Noah out there building the ark and saying, my God who created us all says a flood is coming to destroy us all because we're continually wicked and violent all the time, they had an opportunity, at least some of them, we can presume, to repent and change their mind and change their ways. But they didn't. They chose corruption. Verse 13, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood, Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shall thou make it. Let's stop there. So here God is instructing Noah to build this ark. Now, a couple of things we need to understand. This word ark doesn't mean boat. It means chest. It's a box. It's a chest. Which is interesting to me because every movie and every story ever told shows this boat, floating out on the water with a big deck and maybe a sail or a flag or whatever. Even the big museum, I think it's in Arkansas, that was built several years ago, that tried to create it, very realistically. It looks like a boat. Here we have dimensions of height, width, and breadth. It's called an ark, which is a chest. Really, the way I see it, this was like a shoebox sized, a huge. And by the way, when we transliterate these dimensions, the ark is believed to be about the same size as the Titanic. So it was a big shoebox, but it wasn't a boat. It was meant to house Noah and his family and the animals and their food, and it was meant to float. Really, and that's it. I mean, the water rose and it floated. But God instructs Noah to build this ark. He tells him how to make it. He tells him the dimensions. He tells him what wood to use. He tells him what to use to seal it. He tells him to put a window in it and a door. That's it. There's no deck. There's not a bunch of cute little portal windows. There's one window and one door. So these people would have been sealed into the ark for the length of the flood, which I can't remember how long that is. We'll see that next week, where God says he sealed them into the ark, with the exception of this little window. Okay, so let's see. Verse 17, and behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. And of course, we know everything doesn't die because Noah is going to be spared. And like I said before, I would imagine much of the sea life was spared. We can go up and see some from the other verses and place it all into context together to get a better idea of what they're talking about there. So verse 18, but with thee, that is Noah, will I establish my covenant. And thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. Now, here's the first introduction to this word covenant in the Bible. And let's look really quick at the Noahic covenant. We have several covenants throughout the Bible. There's the Abrahamic and the Mosaic. This is the first covenant. It's the Noahic covenant. I just brought this up right here. It's a good little summary of what it is. This is a covenant God establishes with Noah after the flood, in which he resets and renews the blessings of creation. He resets and renews the blessings of creation. reaffirming God's image in humanity and the work of dominion. Reaffirming God's image. Remember, he created mankind in his image. That is to say, a very specific human creation, human species creation, or human creation. Yes, we have different ethnicities within the human species, and that's different. The human creation itself was very specifically made in the image of God. That is to say, um, well, it could mean a lot of things. It could mean the blood in our veins. It could mean the brains in our head. It could mean the organs inside our body, the skin and the bones and the muscle that hold. These are the things that God created within humanity that are in the image of God. And so now something comes along and somehow changes that by interbreeding humans with angels, and makes a new species or a new kind that's not created in the image of God. It's something different. So it reaffirms God's image in humanity and the work of dominion. This covenant promises the preservation of humanity and provides for the restraint of human evil and violence. So if you've ever wondered, like, here God is saying that the whole earth was filled with violence. And yeah, we have violence today, but, and we have a lot of violence, but we have a lot of goodness in the world as well. And that's because of this restraint of human evil and violence. And my understanding is it's because God lives in us. God lives in those of us who choose to have God live in us. And with God living in us, the church is present in the world, and it's God restraining that violence through that buffer, so to speak, those people. Kind of like, well, we won't get into that. So let's get back to this. He said, but with thee I will establish my covenant. And we're going to see that after the floods subside and that Noah and his family come out of the ark. I will establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife. Okay, verse 19. And of every living thing of all flesh, two of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Now this is interesting. Do you guys see here what it says? And of every living thing of all flesh, two of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark. So this word sort is different than the word species. So the word species, if we think of, like, we talked about this a little before earlier here in the book of Generation when God was creating the different animals, the different kinds. When you think of, like, canines and felines, for example, cats and dogs, canines and felines, when you think of a canine, that's just a grouping or a sort of all these different other species, right? You have your wolves and your foxes and your greyhounds and your poodles, you have all these different types within that sort that of canine. Same thing with feline. Ligers and tigers and lions and pumas and Siamese cats and whatever. You have these different species within their sort. So a lot of times people will say, oh, how can anybody believe that story? There's no way they could fit that many animals in this boat. One, it wasn't a boat, it was an ark or a chest. Two, it was really, really big, the size of the Titanic, with 3 levels, 3 floors. So it could have held a lot of animals. And Noah wasn't necessarily instructed to go out and get 2 of every species. He was instructed to get 2 of every sort. Okay? And he was instructed to keep them alive. Male and female, of the fowls after their kind, of the cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, 2 of every sort shall come unto thee to keep them alive. And this is interesting too. It says they shall come unto thee, which means he didn't have to go out and, like, herd them up, right? They came. God, I don't know what he did, but he told the animals, go get in the boat, it's time. And they came to him. His only job was to build the boat, to fill it with food, to receive the animals, and to go into the boat, and keep them alive. And verse 21, and take thou unto thee of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to he. So he did have to gather the food, but he didn't have to gather the animals. and it shall be for food for thee and for them. So he had to bring enough food for his family and for the animals. We can presume that God told him how much to gather, because God knew how long they were going to be in the boat. And the final verse, thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he. So Noah was faithful, even though God asked him to do this incredible thing. You know, the other thing we have to understand here, remember going back to the beginning in chapter 1 of Genesis, when God said, when the author tells us there was no rain, there was only a mist, and then there was this bubble of water around the earth. And we're going to see here next week that when the rains began, the floodgates of heaven were open and the water poured out, and the springs from below were open and the water came up. So we had we had rain, we had the floodgates, and we have the springs from beneath. All three of those things just causing this massive flood. And so, but there was no, up until this point, people didn't even know what rain was. They knew what a mist was. They lived in a tropical, because they were covered in water that would create, a comfortable climate. It would create a lot of food, living in kind of a tropical area. But they didn't know what rain was. And here, God is basically telling him, what does he say? He says, behold, even I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth. And so I don't even know that Noah would have known what that meant, but he was faithful and he built that ark because God said he was bringing a flood upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. So, that would have told him, I better get busy and build this ark. All right. So that's it. So next week we'll be in chapter 7. It's a continuation of the same story of Noah and the flood. In chapter 8, the flood subsides. And then when we get into chapter 10, it goes through the descendants of Noah. And then it isn't until chapter 11 that we start getting past the story of Noah into the Tower of Babel, Shem's descendants, and some of these different interesting things. So that's it for today. I hope everyone's doing well. God bless you. Thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see you here next week. Thanks for watching.